Dave Chatterton once envisioned himself in a fancy office in the Windy City. He ended up a little south in Champaign, Illinois, and he would not change a thing. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and welcome to the American Farmland Owner Podcast, where we talk each week to industry thought leaders about why what is happening, and what to watch in the weeks and months ahead. That is what Dave Chatterton does for a living. Dave is Commodities Division Director for Strategic Farm Marketing and Strategic Farm Futures. I'll ask him about whether he thinks it's time for more American producers to do something else besides corn and beans. We'll also talk about how DOGE could affect local agricultural services. But first, his life in Champaign. And one final note before we start here. We talked to Dave as Congress was finalizing the one-year Farm Bill extension, so keep that in mind as we begin our conversation. Well, Dave, let's start off with, why do you do what you do?
Well, some days I wonder, Dave, that's a really good question. But, born and raised in rural West Central Illinois, been around agriculture my whole life. When I graduated college came out of business school with a finance degree, thought I was going to take over the world in Wall Street. Initially was going to move to downtown Chicago, and that job fell through, and I immediately fell back on my roots, went to work for Bunge, and the rest is history. Been in the grain business or the agricultural side of the business ever since, and just I guess, to be honest, love it more and more all the time. Just have no appetite to be in the city if I can avoid it. And we work with a really good base of clients and customers in a number of states across the Midwest and the growing areas of the U.S. And just always interesting. Things are always changing. It's always a challenge. I'm sure that's true of a lot of other businesses, but I don't think you'll find a more kind of unique and fast-paced in terms of change business than you will in production agriculture. Excuse me.
Do you ever let yourself daydream about what if you would have gotten that Chicago gig?
I think maybe those years are past at this particular point. But yeah, I mean, you always wonder where life would have taken you and different things. And I always get a kick out of people that you meet, Dave, and you might meet somebody. Let's say I'm in Des Moines for something, and I meet somebody, and they're like, "Oh, you wouldn't have heard of where I'm from. It's a really small town in Iowa." "Oh yeah, what's the name of it?" "Yeah, I've been there. I know, Jay Smith." And so, I think the world is really intertwined, and the way that technology has not only come to society in general, but particularly to the farm, it really, the world's pretty small anymore. I'll say that.
Next question is for context. This is one middle-aged dude asking another middle-aged dude this question. So by no means am I calling my guest old in any shape or form, but you've got a few years of experience. And as I kind of look through your background and bio and resume and all that kind of stuff of all the things you're doing, one thing on the most basic level is you're a guy who looks at the past and the present, and you try to determine the future, right? Like, how does that work? And I realize this is an oversimplification of your life, but really that's what you're trying to figure out though, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at commodity markets, you're constantly trying to predict where are we going to land, and they call it a futures market for a reason. They're not talking about what we know today; it's what we don't know in the future and what might shape policy. And you can see the effect that that's had on my hairline over the last 30 or 35 years, but and pulling your hair out and such. But it rolls you out of bed in the morning, Dave. I mean, you want to see how the story unfolds and whether you're right or whether you're wrong or what changes and how quickly you can change and adjust versus your competitor or other people in the marketplace, and kind of that I guess drive to be at the forefront of figuring out what's going to happen next and how we can gain an advantage is really what it's about for our company and for what I do every day and for what we're trying to do for our clients.
And I'm not poking fun of anybody who sits in a corner office in Chicago or New York, any big city like that, but you're not. And the people around you are directly impacted on the most personal financial level, right? Their future's at stake with some of the numbers you're looking at. As you look ahead to 2025, you mentioned sometimes it keeps you up at night, but what is the biggest concern heading into 25?
Yeah, I think it's just margins and profitability, and there's a lot of uncertainty. You can pick the geopolitical front and what happened, what may happen with trade wars, tariffs,
Mhm.
sanctions, you name it. You can pick the economic front where the U.S. seems to be doing better, but we have a lot of our competitors on the export front that are struggling a little bit in South America or the Black Sea. We have a lot of our import customers and people like Canada, Mexico, China that are struggling economically. We're struggling to get a farm bill, extension put together, let alone a farm bill that will guide us over the next number of years. And so when we look at where commodity prices are at, when we look at where input costs are at, and what that means to margins on the farm, and really not a lot that's penciling in the black right now for 2025. And I think our producers right now are looking at to year-end tax planning time and different things. We're starting to look ahead to reviewing operating notes and what it means for 25. And it's it's a little bit of a, for lack of a better term, we're getting a little bit of a come to Jesus meeting about,
Mhm.
hey, where's cash flow going to come from, and how much equity am I going to have to dig into, and how am I going to operate next year? And of course, this, Dave. I mean, there's no generalization in the farm economy. There are people who are very solid, have no debt, own a bunch of ground, and have their equipment paid for. And there's people on the opposite end of that spectrum that may be just starting out or that rent most of their ground and have a high debt load and everything in between. But it's going to be a challenging year here. And I think particularly when we look at it in terms of crop insurance and the commodity pricing element that we work with every day, we're going to have to be pretty quick to act and keep a very tight pulse on what's happening in Washington and what those ad hoc, programs might mean to our cash flow or to our capital flow and how that affects our break evens and our bottom lines.
I've spent most of my professional career in traditional mainstream journalism, television primarily, and that would be, I think, as I've gotten older, maybe one of the biggest criticisms about it, to your point, is that we tend to do this overgeneralization of things.
Mhm.
And so we're lumping ag economy, farm economy, it's all the same. So either everybody's got to be doing great, everybody's going to be struggling, which, as you know, because you live it, that's not the way it works out. Can you dig into, let's talk specifically corn and beans. And the one thing I don't you joked about pulling your hair out. The folks who are in this for a living, it's hard to fathom how you can do it. Although I guess if you're doing what you're doing, and our American producers are insanely good about what they can squeeze out, obviously. But how do you see that shaking out in 25? Like how rough's it gonna be?
Well, I mean, here I'll put it in this way. We had a meeting here in Champaign. We called our annual customer seminar last week, and Bart Fisher from the Texas A&M Agricultural Center was one of the speakers. And Bart's very well plugged into Washington, does a lot of policy stuff with both the Senate and the House, and been doing what he does for 30 years. And they have a model where they have, I think, you don't quote me on this, but I think it's like 52 what they call virtual farms. Behind each one of those virtual farms, and I think it's 17 states is a real operation where they go out every year and talk to that producer about what are your costs, what's happening with this, what's the trend on that, what is your banker saying, what's your commodity guy saying, et cetera. But at the end of the day, they put all that in a model and spin it around and look at looking forward at 25 based on the prices that we have today and what they know. And one of the comments that he made that really struck me, Dave, was that when they did that this year, and they're looking at farms, row crop and production agriculture, they're looking at ranches and they're looking at dairies, was the worst, most challenging results that they had had in 30 years of doing this.
Mm.
And that's exactly what we don't want to hear
Hmm.
for people who are trying to help farmers and producers. But it does mean that they're gonna do that. And when you said there's no generalization, there's really not, but there are certain common things that everyone's working for and selling commodities at the best price that they can and creating positive margins. And, for lack of a better, a less, I guess the most simplistic way to say it, farmers are good at farming and farmers want to go farm. They want to be on a tractor. They want to be on a sprayer. They want to be on a combine. They want to be making, be in the field and making those decisions for the most part. And that gives us the opportunity, I think, to help them with things like crop insurance and safety net issues and things like marketing crops and what markets might do and kind of putting those things together. So no standard recipe, but certainly an interesting proposition.
This is a hard question, but so as we kind of look ahead, our producers are phenomenally good at producing and at squeezing. Do we, do we, are we too good at it? In the sense that are we just growing too much of this stuff and we would be better served if some of these folks can segue into something that could be profitable and sustaining for them, or do we just simply need to expand the market, whether we can somehow do that domestically, maybe with biofuels, sustainable aviation fuel, or is it exports? Or is this question just way too crazy?
Well, it seems like a question we've been asking for a lot of years now, and
Yeah.
decades now, I guess I should say. But I think it's all of that, Dave. When you look at the productivity of the farm and where yields have gone and how good, these guys are at what they do, it's a combination of, the science and the agronomy side of things combined with what they do and, what it costs to what I call go farming these days in terms of having the equipment, having the labor, having the seed, the chemicals, all the things that you need to
Hmm.
grow a good crop. This is a high stakes capital game, excuse me, and you have to be pretty precise. But growing markets is certainly something that we need to look at. And there's been a number of different biofuel initiatives talked about. Sustainable aviation fuel is a holy grail for the corn market and,
Yeah.
biodiesel and different things. But we have a lot of competition around the world. So the more diversity that we can find in terms of either different crops or different uses for the crops that we have is really, it doesn't, I don't think, get enough time and probably, research and funding in terms of what we're doing. We're always trying to grow market share on exports. We're always trying to grow, crush what we can, export what we can, et cetera. And that's fine. We've done a good job of that. But at some point, we're getting to the point with acreage expansion in places like the Black Sea, parts of Africa, and certainly parts of South America, where we're raising it, we've got the peak population in China. We've got the, peak population coming from a global standpoint and not too far down the road. We need to feed the world, but we also can't outgrow our supplies here. So, it's a really interesting question, but, it always comes back to, well, you first. So you stop
Hmm.
producing or planting those acres, or
Yeah.
you plant those acres to fallow or to switchgrass or whatever, and I'll keep growing my corn. And the way that farmers have, survived and banked equity and grown to this point has literally been to grow more product, to have more, units to sell, to create more revenue. And that's the model that we're familiar with, and I don't expect that to change really anytime soon.
Yeah, you need the other guy to grow less, so yours is worth
Mhm.
more. But who the heck's going to be willing to do that?
Well, and that's just it. And I mean, it's certainly not going to happen in the U.S. where we aren't expanding land, but it's also not going to happen in a place like South America or
Yeah.
Brazil where their currency is favorable. They've got the land to do that. They've got degraded pasture and things that they can do without, going into the rainforest, and they can continue to expand that area. And, you know, I'm not saying that growth at the agricultural level is dead. Don't take that wrong. We're still going to continue to grow and need more products, whether that's foods or proteins or grains or proteins or whatever it might be. But in doing so, there is a limit to how the line of yield and production meets the line of demand.
So you mentioned that, switching to something else. So do we need more federal support to minimize that risk for the transition, or what makes that easier? Because that's a big leap of faith by somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest example of that is probably the ethanol industry. And if you look back at what happened in the early 2000s and, the mandate, as it's referred to, required ethanol to be blended into gasoline at a certain, level. And essentially we created a demand base that had
Hmm.
not been there previously, and certainly helped if compare corn prices and, you know, before that period or coming into that period to the notch that we took up after that period. Certainly we saw the financial benefits of that. Now, ethanol, has more or less maxed out in terms of where it's at in the US. We've been against that E10 blend wall for the better part of a decade. There's talk that we may get an E15 year-round provision into the new extension on the farm bill that we're talking about here this week, but that's not going to move the needle. You're talking about maybe 20 to 40 million more bushels of additional corn demand annually. So, on a 5 billion bushel ethanol corn demand base, that's not necessarily going to change the narrative a lot. But what that next thing is going to be, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel, whether it's something else, that we don't know about today, but typically that government backing, federal mandate, cost sharing, you call it what you want, but is the way that that we get to those particular ending points.
I'm going to guess you've heard of DOGE.
Yeah, I think we're all a little curious about DOGE at this particular point.
So it's the depart. It's not really a department, but this department is supposed to be all about government efficiency, and it's something that Donald Trump's got Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy kind of putting together. But so you mentioned, I'm fascinated by that, but a million ways to Sunday. But when you mention crop insurance and others, do you feel like the ag sector has strong enough advocates in DC to make sure that some of these supports are not knocked aside as they look to eyes on the bottom line?
That's a really good question. I don't think anybody knows. There's not a good historical precedent to follow here in terms of what this might mean. You know, like you said, this is a pseudo government agency or an advising agency to the government in terms of how things get done, but still has to run through the traditional congressional or legislative, you know, purse strings and mandates. So it's going to be really interesting to see how those things come together. I guess what I would envision, Dave, is that at some point, if DOGE is going to start doling out cuts, that we in agriculture are not going to be immune from that. So probably the quicker that we can prepare for that and insulate ourselves from that to a certain degree, or at least insulate some of our key programs, maybe like crop insurance and some others, the probably the better off we'll be. But I know that, you know, just from the context that we've got from our Washington sources, that DOGE is certainly looking at things like the budgets of the USDA or the FSA or what the farm subsidies look like inside the Farm Bill. And, you know, there's a lot of politics that certainly go into that. But luckily we do, at this point, we've got a very strong farm, you know, advocacy group in Washington, you know, both inside the congressional building and outside or around it. But, you know, as elections change and different leadership roles change, we'll have to follow and see how that goes.
Who do you think when if they do some trims in that arena, who is most at risk, do you think?
Well, you know, I think the key here, from what I understand and just reading what I've read and kind of listening to Vivek and to Musk about what's going on, it looks like redundancy is the first choice of how can we eliminate redundancy. And when you talk about having a USDA in Washington and an FSA in, you know, every county in the Farm Belt, and then you've got crop insurance data that flows into the RMA that's very similar to what's being, you know, reported at the insurance level. Unfortunately, I think that's where it comes down to. And nobody, you know, you're from, you know, you've seen enough rural small towns. The FSA office, we definitely don't want to see it go away. And I'm not saying that it will. Don't take me wrong, but I think there's some, you know, some degree of fat that probably gets cut not only at the USDA but probably potentially at the FSA level as well.
You talked about trade war, tariffs, and that. When, as a guy focused on the future, how can people possibly prepare for that? Because we don't really know big picture, right? We don't know how much of this could be real. We don't know how these other countries could respond if it is real, and we don't know how much of this is just a threat and a bluff to try to get for Trump to get what he wants, some concessions here. So how do you plan for that?
Yeah, it is a huge pain in the you know what and an unknown. It's just really, you know, geopolitics are notoriously tough to trade. So if you tell me what the rainfall has been so far in Mato Grosso, Brazil, and what the forecast looks like, I can get a trend on, okay, I think the bean yield is going to be here.
Yeah.
If you tell me that, you know, hey, ethanol margins are here and this is what the, you know, the gasoline demand looks like and export, you know, we can get an idea of that. We can still be wrong and we'll have to, you know, be within a range, but we have an idea. At this particular point, it can go either way. And we don't know what we don't know. So what that means is that we have to be more, I think, defensive in terms of how we market grain and how we plan our finances on the farm, and have to be willing to accept a break even or just above break even type of a margin in a situation where we're trying to hit a lot of singles and bunts as opposed to doubles and triples and possibly home runs. And you just have to protect what you can do. There are some changes in the crop insurance front that will maybe allow you to, instead of getting an 80 or 85% guarantee on your revenue in the traditional, MPCI or RP policies, that maybe now we have the chance to do a 90 or 95% level because of some things that have changed this year. And so taking advantage of those, those types of situations, educating yourself about those, working with people who can help you, plan and run those numbers for your particular operation, I think is really important.
If, as I think back what you just said in the last minute and a half, you're basically telling us that it's easier to predict the weather than it is to predict politics. Am I correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, depending on how far out you want to go, of course. But I'll give you an example: a Trump tariff against China, right, and a trade war. And if you look at what's happened, the big three, I'll call it, in terms of what we're worrying about with Trump, at least to get started here. There's been talk of the BRICS countries, but right now it's China, Mexico, and Russia. China, our number one importer of soybeans; Mexico, our number one importer of corn; Canada, our number one importer of ethanol. All very important to the ag and keeping our prices supported. And that's just one example of the ag trade, but we're important to them as well in terms of what they export to us and what they push over into the U.S. So everybody needs to work together here. And we've seen Canada, certainly, Mexico, maybe to a lesser degree, kind of step up to the table. And not that anything's been resolved, but at least, hey, we're moving in a direction where there's a discussion going on about what compromises can be made. China, on the other hand, has been the one that said, no, we're not having it. We're pushing back. We're not taking any of your shit, if you want to put it in the bluntest way possible. And they've rolled out stimulus programs and done some things to try and prepare their economy for that trade war. But go back to the 2016, 2018, 2020 experience, and we did have the tariffs in place against China that are largely still in place today, as a matter of fact. But initially the market had a terrible reaction to that. But then we got the phase one trade agreement, where all of a sudden China's going to buy probably more than they need from the US because they're trying to appease us on these certain situations. So you can have the good outcome, follow, the bad and the good, you can mix that all together, but which path that's going to take and what the timing of that path is really going to be, a particularly tough one to navigate, I think, going forward. And we spend a lot of time working on it, and sometimes I wonder why we do, but we can't just sit here and do nothing. So
outside of China, where are you seeing some positivity as far as an expanding market outside our border, especially as we look to 25?
Yeah, well, I mean, the biggest growth country, in the world right now is India, and certainly anything that we can do with India in terms of wheat or feed grains would be phenomenal. Mexico has been a huge buyer of corn for us, and in both of the last years, they've had a drought in their domestic crop that's really upped their needs. Keep in mind, the corn that they buy from us is yellow corn. It's not the white corn that they use for tortillas and domestic food production. It's for cattle, pork, poultry, et cetera. So, Canada and Mexico really have been our biggest trading partnerships and most successful ones to date. And I think the more that we can continue to rely on that and build off of I'll call it a NAFTA type of a framework, I think the better that we can be. There's all kinds of political things in those deals that everybody's got their opinion, and there's, some get positive results, some get negative. But from an agriculture and a trade standpoint, stable countries like that we can deal with, as opposed to political people who, don't share our political ideas and want to see us knock down this, China leading the BRICS revolution, trying to get the yuan as the reserve currency, and combined with Russia and some of the bad actors around the Middle East, I'd much rather be working with people on our own continent if possible.
Mexico in particular fascinates me as we go into this next administration, because there's going to be talk, border security, the wall, all that kind of stuff that helped get Trump elected. But as you go forward on this, because of tariffs, because of the importance of trade, and frankly, because of our reliance on international labor that we need, because, we don't have enough bodies and not enough bodies willing to do the jobs we need to do. That country probably fascinates, which is probably crazy to say, more than China, I suppose, with the problems China could cause us. But Mexico fascinates me on what those relations will be like and what that could mean for both countries, right?
Yeah, and I mean, just like what we have here, they have an administration that changes hands every now and
Yeah.
then, and things change and ideas change. But at the end of the day, we need each other, and we need an immigration model in the U.S. that works. I'm not trying to make that political at all, and
Yeah, it's
whether
just reality.
yeah, and I mean, without immigration, if you want to, focus on Japan, you want to look to a lesser degree at China, and maybe the birth rates and what's going on. If you want to stall your economy, that's how you do it. You flatten your population, and you get to a demographic point where you're not growing, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of debt and a lot of less young people who are working and supporting that. So that needs to be a workable relationship, and I think a lot of the lessons learned by the market, by the commodity markets during the first Trump administration were, to maybe ignore that first headline that comes out. We're going to hit China or Mexico with a
Yeah.
25% tariff. Okay. You know, he's shooting the cannonball, but at the end of the day, that's not what we're going to settle on. We're going to be, it's meant to get attention. It's meant to get people to the table. Could it have a bad ramification over a short amount of time? Certainly it could, but at the end of the day, you have to, get it in a workable thing. So I think the upside of this is, hey, maybe we can build a stronger relationship with people like Mexico and do what you said. But there's a all kinds of beyond the immigration and beyond the drug and the safety issue, there's a lot
Mhm.
going on there. There's a lot of trade that needs to happen, and certainly we don't have the labor in the U.S. at a certain to do everything that we need to get done here. I mean, there's a lot of talk of onshoring, U.S. manufacturing and doing different things, but it has a limit. So
And appreciate what you said about not overreacting to the headlines too. And that's another thing that makes me curious about 2025 is because the markets have already experienced Trump in office for 4 years and they know his style, they know how he talks, they know he does a lot of the negotiating in the public sphere, rather than sitting in a boardroom, like
mm,
maybe an old school business guy would do. But do you think then that can the markets kind of chill when they hear him at a rally get all whooped up and say, I'm going to do 25% or 40% tariff or whatever? Do you think the psyche of the markets can, all right, this is what the old man does. Let's not overdo it. Like, I mean, that's hard to restrain there though, right?
it is to a degree, but I think the knee-jerk reaction here will probably be a little softer than what it was back then. But
Okay.
unfortunately, we live in a world today where if I put it in terms of the commodity, trading, space for the Chicago Board of Trade, just for an example, any of the commodity exchanges out here, oils, meats, metals, softs, pick what you want, financials, currencies, about 70% of the orders every day are generated by a computer. So a lot of those computers are programmed to read headlines. And I think the way that those computers are programmed is going to have a lot to do with how much volatility we have in our markets and for how long. So I think you're going to find that you're going to have a shorter volatility period and you're going to have a smaller overall volatility range in terms of what those headlines mean. And it's more of building a process as opposed to, whoa, I'm all in today, whoa, I'm all out tomorrow type of a situation. I think we saw a lot of people make and lose a lot of money in that period, on and off of those headlines. And to a certain degree that educates people. To another degree, it wears them out and they'll stay on the sidelines a little bit longer.
Let's close out as we look ahead to 2025. Leave us with something good here. So we know it's going to be challenging, corn and beans and some others, but
Yeah.
as you look ahead to 2025, because we talked about the importance of not overgeneralizing here. So even if you have to niche this, um, who do you see having a good 25?
Well, I think if you're in the beef business right now or the hog business, you're starting off pretty strong in 25. Beyond that, look, guys, the sky's not falling. I mean, I graduated college, I'll date myself here. I graduated college in 89 and no one was going back to the farm and the farm was
Yeah.
going away and it's never coming back. And yeah, we've had a very vibrant economy and the guys that I went to school with that did go back to the farm, are doing really well at this particular point. So it's a cyclical business. And the more we, convince ourselves that we're in for a really, really tough 25, there's something out there that's going to change. And it's very uncommon in commodity markets for us to have an extended period where we don't have some ability to lock in a price or lock in some kind of profitability throughout the crop year. And I don't think this year will be any different. Do I think that you need to be ready to act and have a plan? Yeah, I certainly do. And I think that plan involves, crop insurance. I think it involves having a marketing plan. It involves working with your finances and your banker and different things and whatever you can do to increase your production, lower your costs, all of that stuff. But the main thing is, be ready and know where you're standing financially, know what your costs are, know what your break evens are. And look, I mean, it's cyclical. We're one weather event away from somewhere around the world to having $8 corn and $15 beans again. And, don't take that as a prediction for 2025, but, if you've been in this business for any period of time, you're used to kind of riding out some of the slower periods and get, and hoping to get into some of the more fat periods. And we're coming off of one of those fat periods. We're in a period, a place now where we've had a good fall off those highs from 2021, 2022. But, the sun will come up again and we'll keep going.
Dave, appreciate the conversation. Happy 2025.
Hey, same to you, Dave. It was fun.
You can learn more about Dave Chatterton's background in our profile piece. It is part of our free weekly newsletter at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Check it out, and you can sign up if you want and get the newsletter sent right to your inbox every week. Again, it's at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmers.